Some might say that one of Devolver Digital's niches as a game publisher is the 2D platformer, particularly ones that evoke a retro feel and art style. Carry On, The Messenger, Gato Roboto, just to name a few. These games were all critically well received, and deservingly so. Enter Olija, which is very much cut from the same cloth. Olija, much like the aforementioned titles, is a 2D action platformer, though it relies a bit more on combat than platforming. While Olija has some great ideas and utilizes well its combat-focused mechanics, these disparate parts ultimately don't coalesce into an overall memorable experience. Players control Faraday, a castaway tasked with reuniting fellow castaways and, ultimately, returning home. The game is structured by level. Think of the overworld from Super Mario Bros. 3. Faraday must travel to each area and obtain keys which unlock later areas, returning back to his interim settlement, Oaktide, between each level. As Faraday finds castaways throughout his journey, they are sent back to Oaktide and will open various shops and otherwise inhabit the town. This does two things I really like in the game. One, it makes the settlement feel more and more alive each time you visit it. And two, you get a shop where you can buy cool hats. And the hats aren't just cosmetic either. For example, one hat gives you acid resistance while another enables you to steal vitality from enemies. They aren't huge game changers, but they can certainly help give you an edge against certain enemies. Faraday's quest, of course, proves more difficult than it sounds though, because there are all manner of enemies and creatures that Faraday must contend with, though their origins are never explained or rationalized. Instead, Faraday must slash or stab pretty much everything without question. That, aside from an introductory cutscene, means that the explicit narrative of Olija leaves something to be desired. But perhaps one of the game's greatest strengths, aside from its combat, is its ambient storytelling. While there often is dialogue that fleshes out the characters around Faraday, Olija's storytelling is at its best when music and artistic presentation combine to evoke emotion as the narrative's driving force. The best example of which can be found in nearly every interaction between Faraday and the game's titular character. It's a shame that Faraday is a silent protagonist in this regard, but in these moments, that mostly blank slate works well. If ambient storytelling is one side of Olija's coin, the other is its combat. Faraday will have a reasonable arsenal of weapons by the time the game concludes, including a rapier, a crossbow, and a revolver, but the shining star of Faraday's weaponry is the clichésly named Harpoon of Legend. Lackluster naming convention aside, the harpoon is used for more than just combat. It's a necessary traversal tool as well, being able to latch on and teleport Faraday to these distant black goops with eyeballs. This isn't just a gimmick, however. Using the harpoon this way is a central traversal and puzzle mechanic in Olija, and it can even be used in combat as well, in both attaching and pulling Faraday toward enemies and pulling Faraday to those black eye goop things to get the drop on enemies below. Its fluidity is remarkable, to the point where I almost would instinctively throw my harpoon at things, follow up with an attack combo, and consistently be amazed at myself with the results. That said, while the game's combat is one of its core pillars, it can also be a confusing mess at times. While I always felt in control of Faraday and his various weapons, there's no real rhythm to combat. I always found myself kind of just pushing buttons and being surprised at the ensuing combo. Sometimes the rapier would instantly kill an enemy, other times it wouldn't. Sometimes the revolver would blast me into the air, and other times I held my ground. There may have been some combat patterns I missed, but the fact they weren't so easily discernible, coupled with the game explaining none of this, left me feeling like I only knew what I was doing about half the time. This is where the game's lack of direct communication with the player becomes somewhat of an issue. While this works well as a narrative driver, it also comes into play in the fact that, outside of a very brief and basic controls tutorial at the beginning of the game never explicitly tells the player how to string together a combo, or some of the effects of certain weapons. Organic discovery in games can work if implemented well, but here I just felt like I was missing part of the core understanding of Olija's combat. Despite the lack of clarity around the particulars of combat, Olija is simply a beautiful work of art to behold. Not only do the aforementioned art and music combine to drive home the game's ambient narrative, but Olija is just a beautiful game in terms of style and art direction. Performance-wise, I did seem to encounter a few gameplay stutters during combat, but I'm not exactly sure if that was a slowdown due to so much happening on screen, or if it was a stylistic choice to emphasize the player's strikes. Either way, it didn't hamper my moment-to-moment enjoyment. That's just it though. While Olija's moment-to-moment combat is every bit as enjoyable as its ambient storytelling, the sum of its parts don't really feel like a complete package. The game's lack of direct communication with the player does make for some confusing combat mechanics, but the core of Olija is a great action platformer coupled with a compelling narrative, even if that narrative relies almost entirely on ambiance. In fact, I posit that's one of Olija's greatest strengths, and a narrative function I wish we'd see more of. Thank you for checking out this review. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to leave a comment and let us know what you think. We'll see you next time.